A 7-year-old girl walked onto a stage with a guitar that was falling apart and made Elvis Presley cry in front of millions. Memphis, Tennessee, summer of 1968. The air was heavy and hot, the kind of heat that sticks to your skin and makes everything feel slower. Inside a cramped recording studio on the outskirts of town, Elvis Presley was preparing for what the newspapers were already calling his comeback. He'd spent years making movies that critics called forgettable. He'd spent years recording songs that his own band members admitted weren't his best work. And somewhere along the way, the man who had once set the entire world on fire with nothing but a cheap guitar and a voice full of raw emotion had started to wonder whether that fire was gone for good. But this story isn't really about Elvis. Not entirely. This story is about a little girl named Clara, 7 years old, brown eyes, quiet voice, and a guitar so beaten up that most people would have thrown it in the garbage without a second thought. Now, before we get into what happened that night, and trust me, what happened will stay with you, I want to ask you something. Think about the most important object you own, not the most expensive. The most important. Maybe it's a photograph, maybe it's a letter, maybe it's something that belonged to someone you lost. Hold that thought, because Clara's guitar was exactly that kind of object, and what she did with it changed Elvis Presley in a way that fame and fortune never could. If stories like this move you, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. We bring you stories that remind you what it means to be human. And this one is something special. Now let me take you back to how this all began. It was a Saturday evening. Elvis was scheduled to appear at a charity event in Memphis, not a massive concert, not a stadium show. This was a smaller venue, maybe 300 seats, set up for a local children's foundation. The kind of event where local acts performed, community leaders gave speeches, and someone famous would show up at the end to shake hands, sing a song or two, and smile for the photographers. Elvis almost didn't go. His manager, Colonel Tom Parker, had told him it wasn't worth his time. Too small, too local, no television cameras, no national press, but Elvis insisted. He'd grown up in Memphis. He knew what poverty felt like. He knew what it was like to be a kid who had nothing and dreamed of everything, so he went. When Elvis arrived backstage, the event was already underway. He could hear a youth choir finishing their last number. He could hear the audience clapping politely. A stagehand brought him coffee. A woman from the foundation came to thank him for showing up. Everything was running smoothly, professionally, predictably. And then Elvis noticed something. Sitting in a folding chair near the back hallway, partially hidden behind a curtain, was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 7. She was wearing a pale yellow dress that looked like it had been ironed carefully, but was clearly not new. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and across her lap sat a guitar. But it wasn't the girl that made Elvis stop walking. It was the guitar. The thing looked ancient. The body was scarred with deep scratches. The finish had worn away in large patches, revealing raw wood underneath. One of the tuning pegs appeared to be a replacement, slightly different in color from the others. The neck had a visible crack that had been glued and reinforced with what looked like electrical tape. And the strings looked like they hadn't been changed in months, maybe longer. Elvis stared at it. He knew instruments. He'd held hundreds of guitars in his life, from the cheapest department store models to custom-built masterpieces. But he had never seen a guitar that looked quite like this one. It looked like it had been carried through a war, and yet someone had clearly loved it. Someone had taken care of it in the only way they could afford to. Elvis walked toward her. The girl didn't notice him at first. She was looking down at the guitar, moving her fingers silently across the fretboard, practicing without making a sound. Her lips were moving slightly, mouthing lyrics to a song Elvis couldn't identify. He stopped a few feet away. "That's a serious-looking guitar you got there." The girl looked up. Her eyes went wide. She recognized him immediately. For a second, she seemed paralyzed. Then she looked down at the guitar as if she were embarrassed by it. "It's my daddy's," she said quietly. Elvis crouched down so he was closer to her eye level. "Your daddy's got good taste." Clara, because that was her name, though Elvis didn't know it yet, shook her head slightly. It doesn't sound very good. Elvis smiled. Sometimes the ones that don't sound good are the ones that matter most. She looked at him as if she were trying to decide whether he was being honest or just polite. Kids can tell the difference. Adults forget that sometimes, but kids always know. "What's your name?" Elvis asked. "Clara." "Clara, that's a beautiful name. Are you performing tonight?" She nodded. "I'm supposed to play a song." "Which song?" Clara hesitated. She looked at the guitar, then back at Elvis. "One of yours." Elvis smiled when she told him. He asked which song. Clara said softly, "Can't Help Falling in Love." Elvis tilted his head. "That's a big song for a little person." Clara almost smiled. "Almost. My daddy used to sing it." There was something about the way she said "used to" that made Elvis pause. He noticed it, the past tense, the weight behind it. He didn't press her on it, not yet. He simply nodded and said, "Well, I'll be listening." A few minutes later, the host of the event introduced Clara. The audience clapped politely, the way audiences do for children they don't know, encouraging but distracted. A few people were already looking toward the wings, hopping to catch a glimpse of Elvis. Clara walked onto the stage. Under the lights, she looked even smaller. The guitar was almost too big for her. She had to angle it sideways against her body just to reach the fretboard properly. She sat down on the stool that had been placed at center stage. She adjusted the guitar. She looked out at the audience. And she froze. For about 5 seconds, which feels like an eternity on a stage, Clara didn't move. She just stared at the sea of faces looking back at her. A few people shifted in their seats. Someone coughed. The host glanced backstage, unsure whether to intervene. Then Clara looked to her left. Elvis was standing just off stage, partially visible behind the curtain. He caught her eye, and he did something simple. He gave her a thumbs up. Clara took a breath. She placed her fingers on the strings. The first chord came out rough, slightly out of tune. The guitar buzzed where the frets met the damaged neck. A couple of people in the front row exchanged glances, not cruel, just surprised. This wasn't the polished performance they'd been expecting. But Clara kept going. Her small fingers moved to the next chord, then the next. The guitar fought her at every step. Notes rattled, the rhythm stumbled, but somewhere underneath all of that imperfection, there was something unmistakable. There was feeling. Clara began to sing. Her voice was thin and fragile, barely louder than a whisper, but there was a sincerity in it that made people lean forward. She wasn't performing. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was singing the way someone sings when they're alone in their room and don't know anyone is listening. She was singing for someone who wasn't there. Elvis watched from the side of the stage. His arms were crossed. His jaw was tight. The woman from the foundation noticed that his expression had changed completely. The casual, relaxed celebrity was gone. In his place was someone who looked like he was remembering something painful. And he was. Because Elvis knew exactly what it felt like to hold a guitar you couldn't really afford. He knew what it felt like to sing a song when nobody believed you had a right to. He knew what it felt like to stand in front of people and wonder whether they were going to laugh at you or listen. He'd lived it. He'd breathed it. And watching this little girl struggle through his song on a broken guitar, he wasn't watching a performance. He was watching a mirror. Clara reached the second verse. Her voice cracked slightly on the high note. She paused. The audience held its breath. Then she found the melody again and kept going. By the time she reached the final chorus, something had shifted in the room. People weren't politely watching anymore. They were genuinely listening. A woman in the third row was dabbing her eyes with a tissue. A man near the back had put down his program and was staring at the stage. And Elvis had uncrossed his arms. His hands were at his sides. His eyes were glistening. Clara played the last chord. It rang out, buzzing, imperfect, alive, and then faded into silence. For 2 heartbeats, nobody moved. Then the applause came, not polite applause, real applause, the kind that comes from the chest, not the hands. People stood up, not everyone, but enough. Enough to make Clara look stunned, as though she couldn't understand what was happening. She looked toward the side of the stage. Elvis was already walking toward her. Elvis stepped onto the stage, the applause doubled, but he wasn't interested in the applause. He walked straight to Clara. He crouched beside her stool. "You did it," he said. Clara's eyes were glassy. "I messed up in the middle." "I know," Elvis smiled. "That was my favorite part." Clara laughed. It was the first time she'd laughed all night. Elvis looked at the guitar. He reached out slowly and touched the neck. "May I?" Clara handed it to him carefully, the way someone hands over something irreplaceable. Elvis turned the guitar over. He examined the scratches. He ran his thumb across the cracked body. He noticed where the wood had been carefully sanded and refinished by hand, not professionally, but with obvious care. Then he saw something on the back. Carved into the wood, just below the neck joint, were two initials, small, neat, deliberate. "Your father's initials." Clara nodded. Elvis held the guitar for a moment longer. Then he asked the question he'd been holding back since the hallway. "Clara, where is your daddy now?" Clara's smile faded. She looked at her hands. "He died," she said, "last winter." The audience, which had been buzzing with energy, went silent, instantly, completely. Elvis didn't look away from her. He didn't glance at the audience for their reaction. He stayed focused entirely on Clara. "I'm sorry," he said, and he meant it. You could hear it in his voice. This wasn't a rehearsed line. This was a man who knew what loss felt like. He had lost his own mother, Gladys, years earlier, and that wound had never fully healed. "What happened?" Elvis asked gently. Clara explained in the halting, simple way that children explain impossible things. Her father had gotten sick. He'd been sick for a long time. He couldn't work anymore. He couldn't play guitar anymore. But every night he asked Clara to play for him. So she did. She played the same songs he had taught her, over and over, sitting beside his bed in a small house in a part of Memphis that tourists never visited. "He said the music helped," Clara whispered. Elvis nodded slowly. "It does." Even when he couldn't talk anymore, Clara continued, he would close his eyes and tap his finger on the blanket, like he was keeping time. Elvis looked down. He pressed his lips together. He was fighting something. Anyone watching could see it. "And this guitar," Elvis said quietly, holding it up slightly, "he gave it to you." "He said it was the most important thing he owned." Clara paused. "He said it saved his life once." Elvis looked at her. "How?" Clara shrugged. "He never told me. He just said that when everything was really bad, this guitar gave him a reason to keep going." Elvis stared at the instrument, scratched, cracked, taped together, held together by stubbornness and love. He understood exactly what Clara's father had meant, because Elvis had once felt the same thing about music. Before the fame, before the screaming crowds and gold records, music had been his lifeline, his escape, his proof that the world could be beautiful even when everything around him said otherwise. Then Clara reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was worn at the edges, as though it had been handled many times. "My daddy wrote this," she said. "Before he died, he told my mama to give it to me when I was ready." She handed it to Elvis. Elvis looked at the paper. He opened it slowly. Inside were a few lines written in shaky handwriting, the handwriting of a man whose body was failing, but whose mind still had something to say. Elvis read it silently. His expression shifted. His brow creased. His eyes became wet. He read it again, then he closed his eyes for a moment. The host, who had been standing a respectful distance away, stepped closer. "Elvis, what does it say?" Elvis opened his eyes. He looked at Clara. "May I read it out loud?" Clara nodded. Elvis cleared his throat. His voice was unsteady, and for a man who had performed in front of millions, that was something the audience had never witnessed before. He read, "Clara, don't ever stop playing, not because I want you to be famous, not because I want you to be rich. Play because music is the one thing in this world that nobody can take away from you. When you're sad, play. When you're scared, play. When you miss me and you will miss me, play. And remember something, you don't have to play perfectly, you just have to play honestly. That's all anyone really needs to hear." Elvis stopped reading. He folded the paper carefully and handed it back to Clara. The studio, the entire room, was silent. Not uncomfortable silence, sacred silence. The kind of silence that happens when a group of strangers simultaneously realize they're experiencing something that matters. Elvis wiped his eyes. He didn't try to hide it. He didn't turn away from the audience. He let them see. Then he looked at Clara and said something that nobody in that room would ever forget. "Your daddy was smarter than me." Clara looked confused. "What do you mean?" Elvis laughed softly, the way people laugh when they're trying not to cry. He figured out in one letter what took me 20 years to understand. Elvis stood up. He looked at the musicians sitting off to the side. They had been hired for the event, expecting to back Elvis for a quick 2-song set. "You know, Can't Help Falling in Love?" Elvis asked them. They nodded. Elvis looked at Clara. "You want to play it again?" Clara's eyes went wide. "With you." "With me. But I'll mess up again." Elvis smiled. "Good, then we'll mess up together." The musicians began a soft, gentle arrangement, slower than the original, warmer. Elvis sat beside Clara on the edge of the stage, his legs dangling over the side like a kid sitting on a porch. Clara positioned the old guitar across her lap. She started playing. The guitar buzzed and rattled, the chords were rough, but this time Elvis didn't just listen. He sang alongside her, and he matched her. He didn't overpower her with his famous voice. He brought his volume down to meet hers. He let her set the pace. He followed her rhythm, not the other way around. It was, by every technical standard, an imperfect performance. It was also the most beautiful thing anyone in that room had ever heard. Clara forgot a chord near the end of the bridge. She stopped for a half-second, her fingers hovering above the strings. Elvis didn't skip ahead. He waited. He hummed the melody softly until she found her place again, then they finished together. The last note hung in the air. Then the room erupted. Every single person stood. The applause was deafening. Clara looked around, overwhelmed, tears streaming down her face. Elvis put his arm around her shoulder. "You hear that?" he said. Clara nodded. "That's not for me," Elvis said. "That's for you." Clara shook her head. "It's for my daddy." Elvis looked at her. Something in his expression broke open. He pulled her closer. And for a few seconds, the king of rock and roll held a 7-year-old girl while 300 strangers cried with them. After the applause finally died down, Elvis made Clara a promise. He told her he would send her a new guitar, not to replace her father's, never that, but so she could practice without worrying about damaging the one thing her father had left behind. He told her to keep the old guitar exactly the way it was. Every scratch, every crack, every piece of tape. "Those marks aren't damage," he told her. "They're proof that somebody loved this thing enough to keep it alive." Then he said something else, something quieter, something the audience barely heard. "And if anyone ever tells you that you're not good enough, you come find me." Clara smiled. "Promise." "Promise." A few weeks later, Clara received a package at her home. Inside was a brand new acoustic guitar, beautiful and polished, with a small note tucked inside the case. The note read, "For practicing, but never forget the one that got you here." Clara's mother later said that Clara placed the new guitar beside her father's old one and stared at them for a long time. Then she picked up the old one and started playing. Years passed. Clara never became a professional musician. She never recorded an album. She never performed on a big stage again, but she never stopped playing. She played at church. She played at family gatherings. She played for her own children years later, telling them the story of the night she met Elvis Presley and played a broken guitar in front of a room full of strangers. And she always said the same thing when people asked her about that night. "Elvis didn't change my life. He reminded me that my daddy already had." As for Elvis, people close to him said that he talked about Clara more than once in the years that followed. He talked about the guitar. He talked about the letter. He talked about how a 7-year-old girl had reminded him of something he'd been in danger of forgetting. That music was never supposed to be about perfection. It was supposed to be about honesty. It was supposed to be about taking whatever instrument you had broken, scratched, taped together, out of tune, and playing anyway. Because sometimes the most powerful thing in the world isn't a perfect performance. It's a real one. Now I want to hear from you. If you could go back and tell your younger self one thing, one piece of advice, what would it be? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one, and I know your answers are going to be incredible. And tell me, where are you watching from right now? I love seeing how far these stories travel. If this story made you feel something, if it reminded you of someone you've lost, someone who believed in you, or a moment that changed the way you see the world, please hit that like button. It genuinely helps more people find stories like this one. Subscribe if you haven't already. We tell stories here that stay with you long after the video ends. And share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Sometimes a story is exactly what someone needs to keep going. Because if there's one thing Clara's father understood, one thing Elvis remembered that night, and one thing I hope you take away from this video, it's this. You don't have to play perfectly. You just have to play honestly. And whatever you're going through right now, whatever feels broken or impossible or too far gone, play anyway. I'll see you in the next one.